The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things. You would open an iPhone box and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. Now, the implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen or somewhere else. But I think we got it wrong. It turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at the designing of things. Now, we assume that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but it turns out that as they got better at the low end of the value chain, they also started catching up on the higher end. We were squeezed from both ends.
U.S. Vice President JD Vance delivered a speech that was immediately after described by his followers as historic. The vice president was speaking at a summit that was organized by the Silicon Valley venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz. This annual meeting in Washington, D.C. is called the American Dynamism Summit, and it brings together corporate executives and U.S. government officials. And one of their main priorities is preparing for war with China. I'm not exaggerating. If you go to the website of this Silicon Valley venture capital firm, Andreessen Horowitz, they have a webpage that describes the American Dynamism Project, and it outlines a scenario for a war with China. They claim that China is supposedly an expansionist power preparing for war, which is nonsense. China has not fought a war since 1979, unlike the US, which is at war every single month. But what this venture capital firm is doing is laying the groundwork for war with China, and it's acting as the intermediary between the US government and private corporations in the military-industrial complex. This is the Silicon Valley venture capital firm that hosted the conference where the US vice president delivered a speech in which he outlined the US government's plans to reindustrialize in order to prepare for war. And given that context, I do think this speech was actually quite important because it provides a very good summary of the Trump administration's economic strategy to try to save US hegemony, to maintain global US dominance by kneecapping all technological rivals, especially China, which the US government sees as the biggest threat to its global dominance. And in this speech, JD Vance outlined the strategy that the US government wants to pursue in order to reindustrialize the United States, to bring back the manufacturing jobs that were offshored, sent to other countries to exploit low-paid labor in the past 40 years or so of neoliberal globalization, beginning with Ronald Reagan.
Deindustrialization poses risks both to our national security and our workforce. It's important because it affects both.
Pro-Trump media outlets have been celebrating this speech as a harsh condemnation of globalization and quoting JD Vance's promises to carry out America's great industrial comeback.
And that's what I really want to talk about today, why innovation is key to winning the worldwide manufacturing competition, to giving our workers a fair deal, and to reclaiming our heritage via America's great industrial comeback. And I believe that's what we're on the cusp of, a great American industrial comeback.
But in a nutshell, what essentially he's saying is that the Trump administration wants to unite the populists, as they say, with Silicon Valley, with big tech corporations. Vance argues that there's no contradiction between working class people who supported Trump and billionaire oligarchs in Silicon Valley and big tech corporations, which is obviously an absurd argument. But he's trying to bring these forces together against China, against the global South, and he's arguing that the US will reindustrialize by imposing very high tariffs and cutting taxes on the rich and cutting taxes on corporations. And he scapegoats China for all of the problems in the US that were caused by neoliberal globalization. However, Vance and the Trump administration are trying to separate the neoliberal economic policies of people like Ronald Reagan because they support those policies like tax cuts on the rich, privatization, deregulation. They're continuing with all of those same neoliberal economic policies that benefit the rich at the expense of the working class, but instead they're scapegoating foreign countries and especially China. Now, first, I should explain some context. Who is JD Vance? Where does he come from? He is a Republican politician whose entire political career was cultivated by the billionaire Silicon Valley oligarch Peter Thiel, who's very right-wing, very conservative. And JD Vance has tried to market himself as a so-called populist and a national conservative. And he has milked his life story, which is not entirely true, but there are elements of truth, that he grew up in a very humble working class family in Ohio and Kentucky. And he wrote a book called Hillbilly Elegy, which was made into a Netflix movie. But in reality, there were significant parts of that story that were left out. So yes, he did come from a relatively humble background, but then he went to Yale Law School, the elite Ivy League university. And then after that, he worked as a corporate lawyer and he worked as a venture capitalist. He is very closely linked to Silicon Valley billionaire oligarchs like his former boss, Peter Thiel. He worked for Thiel. And then when JD Vance ran to be a member of the US Senate, Peter Thiel donated $15 million funding his campaign, which is why Vance won the senatorial race and became a senator of Ohio for one term. And then Trump selected him to be vice president. And I think the main reason that Trump chose Vance is because he is very right-wing ideologically, but he's also very deeply involved in Silicon Valley, in big tech corporations, and Trump wanted to bring those people into his camp, into his political coalition. And this is why Donald Trump invited the world's richest billionaire oligarchs from these big tech corporations to his inauguration, including Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, including Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, including Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, including Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google and Alphabet, including Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and also Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. These big tech oligarchs in Silicon Valley have been waging an economic war and a tech war against China and working with the US government to try to block any Chinese competition so they can maintain monopolies. In fact, JD Vance's former boss, Peter Thiel, published an article back in 2014 in the Wall Street Journal titled "Competition is for Losers," and he argued openly, proudly, that Silicon Valley corporations, they don't want competition in free markets, they want monopolies. They want to entirely dominate their industries because that's the way that they're the most profitable. If you actually have a lot of competition, then profit margins are reduced over time. There's a falling rate of profit. But if you have no competition, you can charge monopoly rents and become very, very rich, which is how most of these Silicon Valley oligarchs became not just billionaires, but centi-billionaires with hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth.
If you're starting a company, if you're the founder, entrepreneur starting a company, you always want to aim for monopoly, and you want to always avoid competition. And so, hence, competition is for losers.
Although the US government has always provided support for the Silicon Valley monopolies, regardless of whether or not the president is a Democrat or Republican, under Trump, it has become so blatant, so in your face. He even selected Elon Musk, the world's richest billionaire oligarch, not only to be in his administration, but to be a very powerful figure in the Trump administration who is holding press conferences with Trump regularly at the White House. And the speech that JD Vance delivered at the American Dynamism Summit that was organized by the Silicon Valley venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz is another very good symbol of this. Now, Andreessen Horowitz is named after one of its co-founders, Marc Andreessen, who is a billionaire venture capitalist, and he also happens to have a head that looks exactly like an egg. It's really crazy. But regardless, the point is that these Silicon Valley oligarchs are very close to the Trump administration, and the fact that they invited the vice president, Vance, to speak at the summit, and the fact that he agreed to, is a symbol of how close they are.
And this is why I'm such huge fans of yours, of Ben's and Mark's, and of the entire endeavor. And that we recognize now in our administration is the time to align our work interests with those of all of you. It's time to align the interests of our technology firms with the interests of the United States of America writ large.
And in this speech, Vance tried to reconcile a deep contradiction that exists within the Trump coalition, which is that it brings together, right-wing so-called populists who falsely claim to represent working class people. I mean, they actually end up abandoning and betraying the working class always, but that's part of their rhetoric, right? And on the other side of their coalition are these Silicon Valley billionaire oligarchs who are the ones who actually always benefit. There are at least 13 billionaires in the Trump administration. These are some of the most powerful people on earth. The idea that they have the same interests as humble working class people in the Rust Belt, in deindustrialized areas of the US, it's laughable. They have completely contradictory interests, but the Trump administration is trying to keep both of them together in its coalition, which is obviously very difficult to do. In his speech, Vance tried to reassure the populists that he is bridging together what he calls the techno-optimists and the right-wing populists. And he says, don't worry, these big tech corporations, they're not against you. They're not just going to take away your job and put you in poverty and you'll have nothing to do. He's saying that we will unite and artificial intelligence, AI, can be used to increase the productivity of the US economy, trying to bring these two camps together.
I received some pushback from people who are worried about the disruptive effects of AI. One journalist suggested the speech highlighted the tension between the, quote, techno-optimists and the populist right of President Trump's coalition. And today, I'd like to speak to these tensions as a proud member of both tribes. And let me put it simply. While this is a well-intentioned concern, I think it's based on a faulty premise. This idea that tech-forward people and the populists are somehow inevitably going to come to a loggerheads is wrong.
In his speech, the US vice president actually inadvertently revealed some very important truths about the economic war that the US has been waging against China and how imperialism functions. So listen to this clip here in which JD Vance explains what the goal of neoliberal globalization was: to trap poor countries at the low end of the value chain, whereas the rich Western countries, especially the US, would maintain an intellectual property monopoly and make all of the profits and exploit low-paid workers. He complains that that didn't work out because China and a few other countries, but especially China, was able to move up the value chain and provide competition to US corporate monopolies. Listen here.
There were two conceits that our leadership class had when it came to globalization. The first is assuming that we can separate the making of things from the design of things. The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things. You would open an iPhone box and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. Now, the implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen or somewhere else. And yeah, some people might lose their jobs in manufacturing, but they could learn to design, or to use a very popular phrase, learn to code. But I think we got it wrong. It turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at the designing of things. There are network effects, as you all well understand. The firms that design products work with firms that manufacture. They share intellectual property, they share best practices, and they even sometimes share critical employees. Now, we assume that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but it turns out that as they got better at the low end of the value chain, they also started catching up on the higher end. We were squeezed from both ends.
The goal of globalization, I would add neoliberal globalization, because globalization has existed for hundreds of years. What we've seen in the past 40 years with the rise of free market fundamentalism and neoliberalism is that new technologies made it much easier for capital to move around the world. And previously, in the Keynesian golden era, if you will, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, into the early 70s, most advanced economies had strict capital controls. Capital was not able to simply move around the world freely. But in the neoliberal era, with financial deregulation, starting with Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, what happened is that capital could move freely all around the world. And in this era of neoliberal globalization, JD Vance admits that the goal was not just to profit from exploiting low-paid workers, but it was to maintain a rigid international division of labor in which workers in poor, formerly colonized countries in the global south, in the periphery of the world system, are trapped at the bottom of the global value chain, producing low value added goods and raw materials, primary commodities, exporting agricultural goods and crude oil and unprocessed minerals, ores. And this is exactly what was argued by the dependency theorists back in the 1950s and 60s. These were political economists like Raul Prebisch and Hans Singer, and then later there were more radical revolutionary thinkers like Samir Amin and Paul Baran and Andre Gunder Frank, and they were arguing that the global capitalist system was designed in a way in which there was a world system in which these countries in the periphery were trapped in unfair relations in which there's so much competition at the low end of the value chain. So there are very few profits. The profit margins are tiny because there are so many different countries that can produce different ores or oil or agricultural goods or low value added goods, like, for instance, textiles, t-shirts, and shoes. So they're all competing with each other, and their terms of trade over time fall, whereas the rich countries in the core of the world system, the imperialist countries that colonized most of the world, can maintain their economic privileges by charging monopoly rents because they have monopolistic control over high value added technologies with very little or even no competition. And the dependency theorists argued that the countries of the periphery should use state-led economic interventionist policies in order to industrialize, to move up the global value chain. And of course, the most successful example of that was China, which through a socialist state-led model was able to go from being one of the poorest countries on earth to now having the world's largest economy when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. And today, China represents about 1/3 of global manufacturing production. It is the world's manufacturing superpower. And now Chinese companies are competing with US corporate monopolies. Like, for instance, the Chinese AI company DeepSeek created AI models that are just as good, if not better, than the AI models developed by US corporations like OpenAI, which is 49% owned by Microsoft. And even better, DeepSeek made its models open source, freely available for anyone in the world to run locally on their own computer. So what was the response of the US government? It's threatening to ban DeepSeek and impose more and more restrictions on China, trying to prevent China from getting access to advanced chips to prevent it from developing AI. Another good example of this is TikTok. TikTok became one of the most popular apps in the world. So what was the response of the US government? To ban TikTok. Another great example is electric vehicles, or EVs. The Chinese EV maker BYD has overtaken Tesla as the largest seller of EVs on Earth. And this terrified Elon Musk, who called for trade barriers to restrict Chinese companies so they cannot compete with Tesla. And then what happened? A few months later, the US government put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. And that was under the Biden administration. Of course, Trump is continuing that even further. And in fact, JD Vance talked about this in his speech. He fearmongered about China's AI, and he said that we have to advance in artificial intelligence to stop China. So what all of this shows is that the US government is working with big capitalists, big corporations, to try to maintain monopolistic control over high-tech sectors to prevent any competition so they can maximize their profits and their rent extraction. Because again, if there actually is competition, profit margins fall and capitalists don't get richer and richer. They want to maximize their profits, and in order to do that, they want monopolies. Again, this was openly admitted by Peter Thiel, the billionaire Silicon Valley oligarch who previously employed JD Vance and who's been a big funder of the Republican Party and especially pro-Trump MAGA Republicans. So in this speech that JD Vance delivered at this venture capital summit, He explains that this is why the Trump administration is returning to these protectionist policies and putting heavy tariffs on China, because the US wants to reindustrialize and it doesn't want competition from Chinese companies.